The courtroom was silent, heavy like a storm about to break. Wooden benches creaked as people leaned forward, waiting. At the center stood a young girl, her hands shaking, her eyes fixed on the floor. The judge looked down at her with cold eyes and a cruel smile. His voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Pick any husband," he sneered, his words filled with mockery. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Faces turned toward her, some with pity, others with scorn. Her heart pounded so loud she thought the whole room could hear. She lifted her head slowly, her lips trembling, but she said nothing. Instead, she raised her hand, pointing across the room. Gasps spread like fire. Everyone's eyes followed her finger. She had pointed at the silent prisoner, the man in chains, the one who had not spoken a word for years. Whispers filled the air. Why him? What did she know? The judge froze, his smile fading into something darker. In that moment, the girl had changed everything, and no one could guess what would follow. The room filled with whispers after her choice. Some people laughed, others shook their heads in disbelief. The judge leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. He had expected her to choose a rich man from the front row, not a prisoner in chains. His voice echoed, mocking her again. "Do you know what you are doing?" he asked. But the girl did not lower her hand. Her face was pale, yet her eyes held a quiet strength. The prisoner did not move, did not even blink. He sat like a stone, silent as always. Guards looked at each other, unsure if this was a joke. The judge slammed his gavel, pretending to be amused, but inside his pride was wounded. He had wanted to shame her, to crush her spirit. Instead, she had turned the moment into something no one could understand. People leaned closer, whispering questions. Why him? What secret was between them? The prisoner's silence only made the mystery deeper. The judge's smile returned, colder than before. He thought he still held power, but in truth, the choice of one girl had already begun to change the fate of everyone in that room. Years ago, the prisoner had been a different man. He was strong, respected, and trusted by many. His voice once carried weight in the town, and his words brought hope. But one night, everything was stolen from him. A crime was committed, and blame fell on his shoulders. Lies were whispered in dark corners, and false witnesses stood against him. The judge declared him guilty without mercy. He lost his freedom, his family, and his name. From that day, he stopped speaking. Silence became his shield, his only weapon against the world that betrayed him. People soon forgot the man he once was. To them, he was just a broken figure behind iron bars, a shadow with no future. Yet deep inside, his heart still beat with memories of truth, waiting for a reason to rise again. And now, as the girl pointed at him, the past he had buried began to stir, like a flame hidden under ashes, ready to burn once more. The girl carried a heavy weight on her shoulders long before the day of judgment. Her family had lost everything: land, respect, even their voices in the town. The judge saw them as weak and used his power to humiliate them. He ordered her to marry, not out of kindness, but to make her a tool for his pride. Suitors lined the courtroom, wealthy men with greedy eyes, waiting to claim her like a prize. She felt their stares cut into her skin, each one reminding her she had no choice. Fear twisted in her chest, yet she refused to bow to it. Choosing the prisoner was not only an act of courage, it was her rebellion. Everyone thought she had tied herself to misery, but in her heart, she believed there was more behind his silence. She carried the burden of shame, but also the spark of defiance. And that spark was strong enough to light a fire that no one could put out. The judge's smile grew sharper as he looked at the girl. He had hoped to see her break, to see her beg for mercy, but instead, she stood firm. His pride could not accept it. He leaned forward, his voice dripping with poison. "You have chosen your misery," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. The courtroom erupted with cruel laughter, fueled by his words. He mocked her family, calling them weak and worthless. His eyes shifted to the prisoner, filled with contempt. "You will rot together," he declared, slamming the gavel. For him, this was not justice, it was punishment. He wanted her life chained, her spirit crushed. Yet even in his cruelty, he failed to see the strength in her silence. The girl lowered her eyes, but inside she held steady. The judge thought he had won, but in truth he had set the stage for his own downfall. Days passed in heavy silence. The girl never gave up, even when the prisoner acted as if he could not hear her. Every morning she greeted him with gentle words, though he never answered. She sat by the cold walls and spoke about her past, her family, and the burden she carried. She shared her fears, her hopes, even the small joys she once knew. At first the prisoner seemed untouched, like a stone that could not feel. His eyes stayed low, his lips sealed, and his body still. Yet something inside him began to stir. One evening, when she offered him a piece of bread, his hand shook as he reached out. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and in that single glance, she saw the shadow of a man still alive beneath the silence. On another night, when she whispered a prayer, he closed his eyes as if listening. These were small signs, almost invisible to others, but to her, they were everything. His silence was no longer empty. It carried a hidden weight, a struggle, and a pain that was slowly breaking. Her kindness was pressing against the cracks in his soul, and little by little, those cracks began to open. For the first time in years, hope slipped quietly into the prisoner's heart, like sunlight entering a room long locked in darkness. But not everyone watched with silence. In the shadows of the courtroom sat a man whose face was known, but whose heart was full of darkness. He had long ties with the judge, ties built on greed and lies. Years ago, it was he who had whispered false words, who had placed the blame on the prisoner to cover his own crimes. While the world thought the prisoner guilty, the true villain walked free, enjoying wealth and power. Now, as the girl chose the silent man, fear grew inside him. He knew her courage could bring questions, and questions could uncover the truth he buried. He could not allow that. His eyes followed her every move, sharp and hateful. At night, he met with guards, slipping them coins heavy with silver, telling them to watch, to wait, to strike when the time was right. His plan was simple. The prisoner must never speak, and the girl must never succeed. He smiled in secret, confident that power was still on his side. But he did not see how the tide of fate was shifting, how truth had already begun to crawl out of the shadows. The hidden enemy was strong, but so was the fire quietly growing between the girl and the prisoner. And when fire meets darkness, one must fall. The wedding day came, but it was not a day of joy. The courtroom turned into a hall of whispers and cruel smiles. People gathered not to celebrate, but to watch a young girl's life chained to shame. The judge sat high, proud of his power, as if he was giving a gift instead of a punishment. The prisoner stood with his wrists bound, iron chains clinking with every small step. His face remained unreadable, his silence heavy like stone. The girl, dressed in simple clothes, walked slowly toward him. Her hands did not shake, though her heart beat fast. She looked at him not with fear, but with quiet resolve. The vows were read, cold and hollow. When the guard forced the prisoner to repeat the words, he stayed silent. Yet when it was her turn, her voice rose clear and steady. "I do," she said, her eyes never leaving his. The room gasped at her strength. Some laughed, others spat curses, but none could ignore her courage. The gavel struck, sealing the marriage not with love, but with chains. To many, it was the cruelest union they had ever seen. But in that moment, hidden beneath the shame and iron, a bond was formed. Not of law, not of fear, but of two broken lives tied together against the will of the world. And that bond, though weak in the eyes of men, would soon prove stronger than the chains themselves. Life after the wedding was no fairy tale. The girl did not move into a home filled with light, but into a cold prison cell that smelled of iron and damp stone. The walls were rough, the air heavy, and every night the sound of chains echoed in the silence. Yet she did not complain. She brought small touches of warmth into that dark place, spreading a blanket on the hard floor, lighting a small lamp when allowed, cooking simple meals with her own hands. She spoke to the prisoner every day, her voice calm and gentle as if speaking to a wounded soul. At first he gave her nothing, no words, no smile, only the same heavy silence. But she did not give up. She read him old stories, hummed soft songs in the night, and prayed beside him when he closed his eyes. Slowly, his silence began to change. He nodded once when she offered food. He shifted his seat closer to her when the nights grew cold. One evening, she heard a sound, faint, almost broken. A single word slipped from his lips, the first he had spoken in years. Her heart leapt and tears filled her eyes. In that moment, she knew her kindness was reaching him. Behind those prison walls where hope was thought to be dead, a fragile thread of trust was being woven between them. And though the world outside mocked their union, inside those walls, something quiet and powerful had begun to grow. But peace never lasts when evil watches from the shadows. The hidden enemy grew restless as he saw the prisoner slowly returning to life. He feared the girl's courage, for it threatened to uncover secrets he had buried long ago. Late at night, when the halls were empty, he met with guards in secret corners. Heavy coins slid across the table, their shine buying silence and loyalty. His orders were clear. The prisoner must not live long enough to speak. An accident was to be arranged, one that no one would question. A fall down the stairs, poisoned food, or a blade in the dark, any way that left no trace. The girl, however, was not blind. She noticed whispers when she entered a room, the way guards glanced at each other, and then quickly looked away. She heard footsteps behind her when she walked the halls at night. Fear pressed against her chest, but she did not run. She stayed close to the prisoner, watching every shadow, every hand that came near his plate. She knew danger was near, waiting for the right moment. The enemy thought her weak, but he did not see the fire in her eyes. She was ready to face him, even if it meant standing alone against power greater than her own. The strike was coming, but so was her courage. And when they finally clashed, only one side would walk away unbroken. One night, while the rain beat hard against the prison walls, the girl discovered something that changed everything. She had been cleaning a corner of the cell when her hand touched a loose stone. Behind it lay a small box, hidden away for years. Inside were old letters, faded with time, and records written in careful handwriting. Her hands shook as she read. The words told a different story, one of betrayal, lies, and a man framed for crimes he never committed. There were names of witnesses who had lied, evidence that had been buried, and even notes signed by men who served the judge's ally. Tears filled her eyes as she realized the truth. The prisoner was innocent. He had suffered not because of guilt, but because of the greed and cruelty of others. She pressed the papers close to her chest, her heart racing. But fear followed quickly after hope. If these letters were found by the wrong hands, they would vanish forever. She had to protect them, even if it meant risking her own life. For the first time, she felt the weight of justice resting on her shoulders. The secrets were no longer hidden, but bringing them into the light would mean war with the most powerful men in the land. The choice before her was dangerous: stay silent and live in safety, or rise and fight for the truth, no matter the cost. The day of truth came like a storm. The girl walked into the courtroom with trembling hands but a steady heart. The hidden box of letters and records was clutched tightly against her chest. The judge sat high on his chair, his eyes cold, his smile sharp, as if already certain of his victory. The villain stood nearby, calm on the outside but burning with fear inside. The crowd gathered again, eager for more humiliation. But this time the girl did not lower her head. She stepped forward and laid the papers on the table, her voice ringing clear. She spoke of the lies, the false witnesses, the signatures, and the crimes hidden in darkness. The judge laughed, mocking her as before, but the courtroom was no longer silent. Gasps and murmurs spread as people leaned closer to see the proof with their own eyes. The villain shouted, denying everything, but his voice cracked under the weight of fear. And then, for the first time in years, the prisoner rose to his feet. His chains rattled as he stood tall. His voice, once thought lost, cut through the noise. He spoke of the night he was framed, of the truth he had carried in silence, of the injustice that had stolen his life. His words shook the room like thunder. The silence was no longer his prison. It became his weapon. The crowd shifted, the whispers grew louder, and the judge's smile began to fade. For the first time, power slipped from his hands, and truth stood unbroken before him. The courtroom shook with voices, but none louder than the truth that had finally broken free. Witnesses who had once stayed silent now stepped forward, their faces pale with guilt. One by one they confessed how they had been forced, threatened, or bribed to speak lies against the prisoner. The villain tried to silence them, shouting over their words, but the crowd no longer believed him. The girl's evidence matched their testimonies, and piece by piece, the web of lies collapsed. The judge slammed his gavel again and again, his voice rising in anger, but the more he spoke, the clearer his cruelty became. People in the room who once feared him now looked at him with disgust. His power was slipping like sand through his hands. Guards who once obeyed him turned their eyes away. The villain, desperate, tried to flee, but strong hands dragged him back into the hall. His crimes were shouted out for all to hear. The judge, once proud and untouchable, sat red-faced and trembling. His cruel smile was gone, replaced by fear. He had mocked the girl, broken the prisoner, and bent justice to his will. But now justice bent back. The courtroom, once his throne, had become his cage. And in that fall, the people saw not the strength of a mighty ruler, but the weakness of a man stripped of his lies. The prison doors opened, not with chains and fear, but with sunlight streaming through the cracks. The prisoner walked out, no longer bent under the weight of silence, but standing tall and free. The girl was beside him, her eyes shining with tears she could not hold back. People who once laughed at her now bowed their heads in respect. They whispered her name with awe, calling her brave, calling her pure. The villain was taken away in disgrace, his wealth and power stripped from him. The judge, once feared, now faced the same shame he had forced upon others. Justice had come, not through swords or violence, but through the courage of one girl who refused to be broken. The prisoner turned his face to the sky, breathing deeply, as if tasting freedom for the first time in years. He looked at her, not with chains between them, but with gratitude and a quiet love. In her choice, she had saved him. In her courage, she had saved herself. And together, they stepped forward into a new dawn, where the past no longer ruled them, and the future was theirs to build, stronger, freer, and brighter than anyone could have imagined. This story reminds us that true courage is often quiet. It does not shout, it does not seek praise, but it stands firm when the world pushes hard. The girl had every reason to give in, every reason to bow her head, yet she chose the path of faith and kindness. Her choice looked foolish to many, but it carried the strength to change lives. The prisoner had lived in silence, broken by injustice, but her compassion gave him back his voice. Together they proved that truth cannot be buried forever, and cruelty cannot reign without end. Even the strongest walls of lies will fall when faced with the steady light of honesty and love. Sometimes the smallest hand can point to the greatest truth. Sometimes one brave step can bring justice where it was denied. And sometimes what seems like weakness is the very thing that saves us all.